here quick today. So we're going to finish up chapter 29. Chapter 29, we talked about active versus passive policy, and what were the pros and cons of active versus passive. What is the theory behind using active versus passive? Active being leave the economy alone and let it heal itself, and active being the Fed and the government have to get involved. And so this first slide is just a summary. It's just a summary about the two different approaches, the passive versus active approach. It's just a bit of a reminder about what the first half of the chapter was, because we split it into two chapters. So active approach says the economy is unstable and we need that discretionary policy. Whether it's monetary or fiscal, we need it, or a combination of the two, right? Which is probably the more likely, would be a combination. And then we have the passive approach that says the economy is stable enough. We have those automatic stabilizers in there. Fiscal monetary policy, completely unnecessary, and maybe even sometimes does more damage than good. Honestly, I can see both sides, and there are economists that argue both sides. There are economists who say we don't need the Fed. There are economists that say we can't exist without the Fed. There are arguments for both, right? Economics is really an art, it's not a science, right? Or if it is a science, it's a social science, which means there's a lot of flexibility, right? Because it's about people and how they behave. So, this happens every time. Okay, so we're gonna talk about something called a Phillips curve. We're gonna get through this second half of the lecture, and then I'm gonna give you a disclaimer about everything that we're gonna talk about, okay? I would say that the information in your book about the Phillips curve might be a little antiquated. There probably is more up-to-date information about this particular tool. So Phillips curve, what's a Phillips curve? Well, there was an economist, his name was Phillips, and he wrote, it was a long time ago. Early 1900s, I wanna say, maybe it was 40s, 50s, something like that. I can't remember, but that's neither here nor there. And he wrote a paper basically that talked about the relationship between unemployment and inflation rates. Now you're like, who cares, right? Well, or if you thought long enough, you'd probably say, yeah, okay, this makes sense. Well, it was very revolutionary at the time, right? And so a Phillips curve is basically the blue curve you're seeing on the screen. And it's a trend line. It's a trend line about the relationship between inflation. I'm sorry, I might have said interest rates. I hope I said inflation rates. I meant inflation rates. Between inflation and unemployment, not interest and unemployment. Apologize. And it's a trend line. So you can see on this particular example, C and D don't actually fall on the Phillips curve. It's not like a demand curve where all your points, all your information lies along the curve. It's a trend, right? So it sort of marks that middle ground in all your data set or your data points, right? And so what we're going to talk about is the inverse relationship. Anytime there's an inverse relationship, we should expect a downward sloping curve, right? Which is what we see here with the blue Phillips curve. We can see that we're showing an inverse relationship between inflation, how much prices are changing, and unemployment. And you can see that according to the Phillips curve, according to this theory that Phillips came up with, as inflation goes up, right, unemployment goes down. Well, let's think about that. That's saying when people are working, right, when we have full employment, maybe even better, right, that we would expect to see really high rates of inflation because we have all these people producing all this stuff and making all this money that increases demand, which takes prices up. Okay, that totally makes sense, right? We've talked about all of that stuff. Well, you're going to see when we get to the end and I talk about what our situation was. Let's go to last year here in the United States. You're going to see that we had really low unemployment. We did not have really high inflation. So things have changed over time, okay? But hypothetically, this is what Phillips said. So we're going to make a distinction between a short-run Phillips curve and a long-run Phillips curve, and you'll see why as we go through this. There's not that many slides, okay? I'm going to take it a little bit slow because I know it's something you haven't seen before. So a short-run Phillips curve says that, based on some expected inflation rate, right, which we always have some expected inflation rate in mind, it's that 2 to 3% I talk about, or at different periods in history, it has been different than 2 and 3%. But I would say in recent history, over several decades, we've come to expect that 2 to 3%. This short-run Phillips curve reflects an inverse relationship, the one we just talked about, which means that one's going up and the other's going down, right? That's what that inverse means, between inflation rates and unemployment. And we talked about how that makes sense, right? We know Phillips, his research was very specific about labor rates, about wages, and that's really what he focused his study on. But as economics has evolved, we've been able to take Phillips' curve, which he talked about inflation. He talked about inflation rates in terms of wages. How much were wages going up and down? The fact is we can apply that to just about anything, not just wages. He just did very specific research, okay? So when it says labor, that's Phillips' research. But know that we're really talking about everything, prices of everything, right? So labor contracts are negotiated based on expectations. We know that. I expect to make 2 to 3% more at least every year, and you should too. Do we always get that? No, but that's our expectation because we expect that prices are also going to go up 2 to 3%, and our employer's going to make 2 to 3% more profit, and they should be spreading some of that around, right? Okay, so here's sort of, sorry about this phone thing. So if inflation is as expected, unemployment is at its natural rate. Remember, natural rate doesn't mean 0, right? We call this full employment, and it's typically, what your author said, is it's typically 4 to 6%, right? I think it's a little on the lower side. It's okay, it doesn't really matter. Each economy, right? It might be a little different, but it probably hovers around that range. And it just means we don't have any cyclical unemployment, right? We have those other 3 types, but no cyclical. So all of that kind of means the same thing. If inflation is greater than expected, if prices are greater than expected, it motivates producers to produce more. If you're producing something and somebody says, prices are going up this year, and you're going to be able to charge 3%, 5%, 10% more for your good, you're going to want to produce more of it with the potential that you can sell it for that big profit margin, right? And so then we would see if inflation was high, if prices were going up, they'd be employing a lot of people to try and produce those goods, and unemployment would be less than the natural rate, right? And so here we have essentially what happens with an expansionary gap, right? Suppliers are motivated to produce above potential output. That creates inflation, but it also creates a situation where they're looking for labor because they run out. How do we do that? We lure people back into the market with high wages, or we pay overtime to those people we already have, okay? And then on the flip side of that, if inflation is less than expected, as a producer, you can't charge a high price for your goods. As a matter of fact, you got to take a cut. You got to cut your prices in order to sell your goods. You're not going to want to produce that much. And then we end up with a recession. A recessionary gap is essentially what takes us to this place, right? And we end up with unemployment greater than the natural rate. So you've seen this all before. You've seen this all before. Well, okay, you've seen this first graph before, okay? So what we're looking at is this graph we've been looking at for a month or better, and it's this potential output, long run aggregate supplier, right, potential output, and then aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Right here is this beautiful spot where we have equilibrium or point A right there, potential output. That means everything turned out like we expected it to turn out. This is the holy grail, right, of aggregate supply and demand and output, right? And when we are experiencing sort of that perfect equilibrium, you can see in this case, we have a price level of 103. If you have a price level of 103, that's an index, remember? And the way we talk about a price level of 103 is that 103 means something, right? It means we have seen 3% inflation since the base year. The base year always has an index of 100. So in this case, we find our equilibrium at 103. That means we've seen that 3% inflation since the base year, okay? So 3% inflation, and then we know we're at full employment. Well, in this case, your author just had to pick an actual unemployment rate that was full employment, that was our natural rate of employment. And you can see down there in the description, he picked 5%. So he picked, right, he says 4 to 6, he picked the number in the middle, 5. It didn't come from anywhere, it's been made up, okay? Because each economy is going to be a little different inside that range, okay? So then you can see over to the right is our Phillips curve graph. So we're going to take the information we have on inflation rates and unemployment, and we're going to plot it on that graph. So in this perfect scenario, perfect equilibrium, we have 3% inflation and 5% unemployment, and we have plotted that at point A. Okay, easy enough? All right. Then these are virtually the same graphs we're just going to build. Okay. So in this case, I think I have to click. Okay. So in this case, we ended up with price levels higher than expected. So we have now created, you can see there's an expansionary gap down there now of 0.1 trillion, I have to assume. Okay. And we have ended up with a price level of 105 and unemployment less than the natural rate, right? We're pushing resources to their max here. We're not using them sustainably. But that also can create another point on our Phillips curve. So at point B, when inflation is higher than expected, in this case, we've seen 5% inflation because you see that 105 over there. And again, your author just came up with this number, so it didn't really come from anywhere. Your author is saying that at that point B, your unemployment would be 4% instead of your natural rate of 5. So your unemployment is less than your natural rate, okay? Because people are hiring people faster, there's less, frictional unemployment. It just begins to create a lot of other issues. But in this case, unemployment is less than your natural rate. And we just plotted that at point B, that 5% inflation and 4%. Sorry. Okay, so the question is, on the test, will it give us that rate? Yeah, absolutely. I would never expect you to know what a natural rate of unemployment was because it is a range. So I would always give you that information. Okay. So we're going to continue to build on this next slide. Okay. But we're going to look at the opposite scenario. So here we are back at our perfect, beautiful equilibrium. This was point B. This is what happens when inflation is higher than expected. And we're going to add the last piece because we're only going to plot 3 here. You can plot as many as you want. What happens if inflation or prices end up less than we expected? Well, suppliers are going to definitely pull back, right? And people are going to lose jobs, which is going to change demand. All kinds of other things are going to happen. So you can see that we end up with a price level of 101, 1% inflation. And again, this was a given. Your author is saying at point C, you'd have 6% unemployment. And so we're just going to use his number, and then we plot C over up on our Phillips curve graph. And then we just connected those. This one is a nice, neat Phillips curve. Remember, a Phillips curve, and this is a little bit of a disservice that your author has done. Remember, a Phillips curve is really a trend line. You wouldn't typically see all of your points actually sit in a nice line with a nice slope, right? It's a trend line, but he's just giving you a nice, neat example. The fact is, you're never going to see a Phillips curve again unless you're an econ major. You're never going to talk about this. It's just having you understand what's happening sort of in the background of an economy. Okay, so don't worry too much about the specifics.
So I have a question. So on a test, when there's different points, would we still have the Phillips curve, or would we have to figure that out ourselves?
You would never have to figure out a Phillips curve as a trend line. It will always just be this nice, neat thing like you're seeing here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Sorry about that. And on your homework, because I do believe there's a Phillips curve question on your homework, it's nice and neat like this. It's not a trend line situation, but I just want you to know in reality it is what it is.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. Okay. So I think maybe this is just giving us the same thing again. Oh, we have this new piece of information. Okay, so we showed you the short run Phillips curve, and it's that downward sloping line A, B, and C, right? But you can see something else showed up there. And it's the long run Phillips curve. The long run Phillips curve is very different than the short run. How can I say that the short run Phillips curve in the long run looks the same as your potential output line? What is the relationship between inflation and unemployment in the long run? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? In the long run, we end up back at potential output, right? Yeah. So we end up back at full employment in the long run, don't we? Yeah, because full employment happens at potential output. In the long run, there is absolutely no relationship between inflation rates and unemployment, because we end up back at the same place. We end up back at potential output, where unemployment is exactly the same at A, E, and D. It's exactly the same. It's all at 5%, right? But then look at the different inflation rates over to the left of the graph. Yeah, because in the long run, everything corrects itself, right? We end up right back where we're supposed to. You need to know the difference between a short run and a long run Phillips curve. It probably is as simple as what does the long run Phillips curve look like? And your multiple choice answers, one of them is going to be it traces potential output, or something like that. Okay, just making sure you know there's a difference. This is sort of a summary sheet on the long run Phillips curve. When price level is less than expected in the short run, output is greater than potential, it creates that expansionary gap. But in the long run, output is potential. We always come back to that sustainable level of production. In this case, we usually end up with higher inflation and higher unemployment. In the end, right? Because we come back to the same place, right? Higher unemployment than when we had the expansionary gap. Sorry, I should make that distinction. Because remember, we had really low unemployment, lower than natural. So we come back to natural. So where it says higher unemployment, that's just from the short run. Higher unemployment than we had in the short run, but that was not sustainable unemployment rates, right? But then we end up with higher inflation. And if we go back, you can see that, right? You can see that, you know, when we end up at point D or whatever, obviously we're going to end up with inflation rates higher than we had. When price level is less than expected, in the short run, output is less than potential. We have that recessionary gap. This is sort of summary. We already kind of talked about all this stuff. In the long run, you can see we go back to potential. There's a fall in inflation or deflation sometimes, and lower unemployment compared to the short run. Because we're hiring more people, we're getting rid of that recessionary gap and getting ourselves back to potential output. Long run Phillips curve is a perfectly vertical line at the economy's natural rate of unemployment, also known as potential output. Workers and employers fully adjust to any of those unexpected inflation rates and things like that. Remember, it's when things are unexpected that we end up with recessionary or expansionary gaps. We have a recessionary gap now because something very unexpected happened. If you and I knew this was going to happen, we would have made totally different decisions leading up to it that would have had us functioning closer with less of a recessionary gap. You and I would have made different decisions. Employers would have made, government would have made, everybody would have made different decisions. But you really get those gaps when unexpected things happen that we can't account for and that we can't make decisions to prepare for. In the long run, as long as prices and wages are flexible, unemployment is independent of inflation. There is no relationship between the two. Now, some, and we've argued this before, I mean, I don't go into detail, but we've argued that sometimes wages aren't flexible, that we find that wages are flexible up but not down because of the minimum wage. We can't really push wages down unless it's on some sort of a legal market. And some sort of a legal market, right? You could probably pay less than minimum wage and get away with it. Right now, there are probably enough people looking for work that you could pay them $10 an hour under the table, no problem, because in some ways, wages get pushed down, but not in our legal structure. They really can't go down that far. They can go down a little, right? If you're making $15 an hour, they could take you back down to minimum wage, but usually makes people angry and then they're not good workers anymore. So we don't suggest it. The natural rate hypothesis, in the long run, economies tend towards the natural rate of unemployment. We know that. We know we trend towards unemployment, potential output, which is where that natural rate of unemployment happens. So we already know this. And the natural rate hypothesis, this is a hypothesis. This is some economist hypothesis, okay? Is that this natural rate hypothesis says that even if we don't have fiscal and monetary policy, stimulus, aggregate demand stimulus is sort of what this PowerPoint slide says, but we're really talking about monetary and fiscal policy, that the economy would still trend back towards the natural rate of unemployment. That there's enough mechanisms built in a sort of mostly capitalist economy with some automatic stabilizers in it that we would trend back there anyway. which we know we kind of do, but sometimes those gaps are too big to wait out the natural rate hypothesis and hope things are going to get better and hope unemployment's going to get back to its natural rate. Okay. All right. So what you're seeing here, and again, it's a little outdated because, you know, this is, I think this is the author's most recent edition of the book. But you can see that we have some short run Phillips curves here that you can see from some different, very distinct periods in time where we had some things going on. You can see from 74 to 83, super high inflation, right? And then you can see the 2009 to 2012, you can see that we had unemployment rates up to 10%. And that inflation was actually negative, or we saw deflation. You can see how that red line dips below the zero. But these ones are actually drawn like a Phillips curve should be drawn, in that they are a trend line that trends those dots, right? This is where I make the disclaimer to you about the Phillips curve. You were to look at a Phillips curve from 2012 to 2000, and let's stop at 2019. I don't know what 2020 looks like yet. And we looked at that, I think we would see dots that are incredibly scattered and that didn't actually seem to show much of a trend at all. I think curves are, I think policy here in the United States, fiscal policy and probably especially monetary policy, that works on inflation rates so aggressively, I think that we have figured out in our economy, just things have changed. Lots of things have changed. I think that we have figured out that this doesn't always necessarily hold true. That maybe this Phillips curve thing, maybe this theory, this hypothesis, this research is antiquated and maybe did hold true. I mean, it does generally hold true for a lot of those periods of time. But I think we would see that over time, that relationship, especially recently, has really started to weaken. And that, like I mentioned to you, last year, 2019, we had inflation rates that were really low, and we had unemployment rates that were also really low. And so that would have, I mean, that's an anomaly on this graph, right? And so just food for thought is, I have a feeling that your author needs to do some updating on this section of the book, but this probably isn't a great tool talking about present time and maybe even talking about this relationship out into the future. It's probably not. It's probably not still as appropriate as it once was. So, all right, peeps, told you it was going to be quick. That's all I have. Please spend a